My name is Dan Schnur. I'm the director of the Unruh Institute of Politics here at USC, and we're very happy to have you all for tonight's second of two convention night viewings. As was the case last week when we watched Governor Romney's acceptance speech, we at the Unruh Institute are very happy to be co-sponsoring tonight's event with the Annenberg School for Communication and the Center for Communications Leadership. We're also especially pleased to have Dean Geneva Overholzer here with us tonight to help lead us in a conversation that's going to take place after tonight's speech. So for those of you who joined us last Thursday night, you know that after the president finishes, we will have a panel discussion in which we hear from faculty experts, political experts, and student experts on what the president said and if he accomplished his goals. And we hope as many of you as possible will stay around for that discussion, because once you hear from the experts, we want to hear from you and have a chance to let our guests answer your questions, hear what you thought about tonight's speech. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and we hope over the course of this fall semester and over the course of this general election campaign, you'll continue to join us for our other events. Every Wednesday, we meet at 11:30 a.m. in the Taper Center for our Road to the White House weekly lunches, and we'll be doing a series of evening events throughout the fall as well for the 3 presidential and the vice presidential debates, and for other events that we'll be advertising too. So we're very, very happy to have you all here tonight. In just a moment, Senator Durbin's going to come on to introduce the video that introduces President Obama. We hope you'll stick around not only for the president's speech, but for the discussion afterwards. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your interest. And we'll look forward to talking with all of you after the president finishes. Enjoy the evening. Thanks very much. We hope everybody enjoyed the speech. And we hope as many of you as possible will stick around for post-speech pizza and post-speech political conversation. I met most of you a little bit earlier, and I want to introduce you, though, to our panel. Sitting directly to my right is Geneva Overholzer. Many of you here at Annenberg know her as the dean of our school of, as the director. We think she should be the dean. The director of our School of Journalism here. But as I think many of you know also, Geneva spent many years covering politics for the Des Moines Register, for the Washington Post, and has been watching these conventions and these campaigns for quite some time. Geneva, we're very happy to have you with us tonight.
It's great to be with you again. Thank you. Always fun.
Sitting at the far end of the table for me, for those of you who've attended our programs in the past, is our good friend Matt Rodriguez. Matt's currently the director of the Los Angeles office for the public affairs firm of the Dewey Square Group. But in 2008, he served as a senior advisor to both the Obama primary and the Obama-Biden general election campaign. Matt, thank you for skipping Charlotte in order to be with us here tonight. We appreciate it.
Happy to skip it.
And finally, for those of you who've attended our programs in past years, you know that we will not do any programs at the Unruh Institute unless it includes students, not only as audience members, but as panelists and participants. And tonight we're very, very, very fortunate to be joined by Kaya Masler, who is the president of USC Trojans for Obama. Kaya, thanks for joining us. All right. So I'm going to start with Geneva. Geneva, as a once and future journalist,
Exactly.
Since you are not writing about tonight's convention speech, but observing on it, if you were writing, tell us what the headline and tell us what the lead is for tonight's story. I was reading some of the pre-coverage before the president started. The reporters had already seen early copies of his speech. And one of the major newspapers put the following headline on their pre-coverage. They said, quote, "Obama pleads for patience." Is that a fair headline for the speech?
I wouldn't give it that. Of course, we heard that. We heard those words. I mean, I wrote down, the challenges remain. We are on our way, not quick or easy. But I actually think that the sort of other side of that coin was the more surprising and stronger note. He didn't give up on hope. He didn't walk away from that whole hope thing. I think, if anything, in that closing, you know, that litany about, I never said this journey would be easy, yet our path is, yes, our path is harder, but to a better place. I mean, he really still talked a whole lot about hope, all the litany of picturing factories dotting our landscape. And, you know, he was there telling the crowd with that remarkable, rousing, you did this, you did this. I mean, I practically burst out in song myself, only you know, because he just kept saying that. I think, in fact, the emphasis...
Let's get her something harder than the water to see if we can get her to break out in song before the panel's over.
No, I would say that, in fact, the headline is Obama stays with hope.
Obama stays with hope.
Yeah.
Kaya, now as the campus director, but as obviously someone who's integrally involved in the campaign on a broader scale, you know, as do a lot of our audience members tonight, that one of the real challenges for the president in his campaign is not so much persuading voters horizontally to switch from Romney to Obama, but rather remotivating a lot of those voter groups that were instrumental to his victory in 2008. Geneva talks about a message that she found very resonant and very much reinforcing what he talked about in 2008. Was that the goal tonight? To say to young voters, to say to minority communities, to say to female voters, hey, I'm still the same guy you got all that excited about 4 years ago?
I mean, I think absolutely. We saw in 2008 his speech was heavily policy-oriented. It had a lot more technical language, and I think this year he's really trying to answer the question, what have I done, but more, what can I do for you still? I think that young voters, we're not going to be taken for granted. What I've experienced out in the field registering voters, and what also is reflected in the polls, is that an overwhelming majority of young voters are registering independent, libertarian, decline to state. And what we want to see is, you know, how can we get over this squabbling over partisan rhetoric? How can we move forward? And that's, I think, why his slogan is forward. And I think that Clinton actually has helped Obama out in large part with this by kind of standing as this moderate proxy for the campaign. While Obama needs to motivate his base, he needs to rile it up, he needs to quote his favorite quote from the scripture again. Clinton really goes out there and talks about what he's done to work with Republicans, what he's done to cross party lines and get things done, and that's what you saw. I think he talked about 5 Republican ex-presidents in his speech last night, and so what we're seeing is a response to young voters' will to really think critically. Not underestimating them, but also it's going to be a challenge. I mean, he's down to 41% support from young voters, whereas he had 66%. But we're hopeful.
So the hope thing is working.
For me.
I want to come back and talk about Bill Clinton's speech in just a little bit, because I told my students on the first 2 weeks of class, I said, I want you to watch Romney, I want you to watch Obama, because I want you to understand the stakes in this election. But I want you to watch Bill Clinton, too, because he is one of 2, along with Ronald Reagan, 2 of the most effective political communicators of the last 80 years of American history. And for those of you who did not have a chance to see President Clinton's speech tonight, whether or not you happen to agree with his conclusion, I'd urge you to go find it on YouTube and somewhere to watch how someone very, very talented at the art of political communication does their job. But, Matt, I want to stick with tonight for just a little bit more. So you were there 4 years ago in Denver, and you've been on both sides of these campaigns, nominees who went on to victory and those who came up a little bit short. For a speech like this one, you got 2 audiences. You got to win the room, you got to win the hall, but you also got to speak beyond the hall to the rest of the country. Pretty clear watching tonight's speech that he won the room, and that was a room inarguably that wanted to be won. Talk about how he both reached out to his loyalists in that room and how he reached beyond that to a broader electorate.
Well, I think the table was set pretty well for him. Michelle had given a great speech, very well received. Nobody does better than Bill Clinton, which he did last night. So I think people were fired up to see him, and I think he knew he was going to win the hall. He's the incumbent president. He should win the hall. That's one of the issues Romney has, is there's still, even now, I think, a little bit of tepid enthusiasm for him. I don't know if this speech changed much, though. He was speaking beyond the room, but he was speaking in the same things he's been speaking about, frankly, for the last 3 or 4 years. We'll see if it makes it. I think he'll get a bump because I think the enthusiasm was there. I think they had a better convention than the Republicans did. But at the end of the day, it was what they are doing, and I get why. They have a challenging atmosphere, and they are trying to slice the electorate as much as they can. So there was something, this was a very classic Democratic speech. Something for women, something for minorities, something for LGBT voters, something for economic populists, labor. I don't say that negatively, I'm just saying this has become an election where they have got as best as they can say, what is our path to victory in the targeted states? And that was what his speech was for. And I think it was really aimed at sort of giving people a reason to vote from policies that he's espoused previously. And I think the energy was to try to rekindle some kind of fervor or enthusiasm that I think has just been lacking, frankly, on both sides in this election. And I think he probably did both of those things pretty well, but I'm not sure his policies, they don't change all that much. Their policies have been talking about now for 3 or 4 years. There really wasn't anything new. This was just a chance to try to pump people up. And he's a little bit ahead. I think he'll probably be even further ahead after a few polls come out after this.
I wonder if I could just, one thing that struck me as a little different, and you all, I'm sure, have followed him more thoroughly than I have. I've been running the school. I'll get back to this life. But one thing that struck me a little differently tonight was his emphasis on citizenship. And he used this string of words: love, duty, freedom, charity, patriotism. These are very conservative values in many ways, right? These are not, I mean, he was kind of making a bid for an America and all of USA and all this. I mean, it almost felt to me as if this was a Democratic convention that was seeking to reassert its title to these age-old virtues in a way that was newer this time.
I think it's a great point. It was not something you see as frequently historically at Democratic conventions as at Republican conventions. Something else that you don't historically see as much at Democratic conventions as you did tonight is that strong an emphasis on foreign policy and in particular national security. Kaya, it's been written that Barack Obama is the first Democratic presidential nominee since John F. Kennedy who goes into a general election without facing a disadvantage in terms of voter perception on issues of national security. A lot of the people in the hall tonight, of course, opposed the war in Iraq, and they cheered him heartily when he talked about ending it. But they also cheered him heartily when he talked about Osama bin Laden. It was an interesting choice by Obama and other leading Democrats to put as much of an emphasis on national security, even in an election that's going to be driven by the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're seeing here is actually somewhat inspiring for those of us who are looking to the next 20 years in politics. What I saw when I watched the Republican National Convention is they talked about community. Romney spoke about how church groups would get together, and although he picked up the religious right with that statement, he also spoke over and over about community, family, charity. These are all typically Democratic values that I think are transferring over to the Republican Party. I read an article talking about how the Democratic elite has become what the Republican Party used to be, and there's this sort of role reversal. I think they're really all trying to fight for this middle class, but what does the middle class mean? There's this wide range, and that's allowing this kind of blurring of the lines, especially when there's two candidates who, for the most part, look fairly alike in terms of, how close they are to the middle of the party line.
Matt, just to pick up on Kaya's point, you mentioned a few minutes ago the elements of the speech that Obama targeted to traditional Democratic constituencies, to women, to minorities, to younger voters. There was one line that struck me that did not seem targeted to a Democratic constituency. He said, quote, "Remember that not every problem can be remedied by a government program from Washington." Yeah. Now, some of us at this table, if not more broadly in the room, remember Bill Clinton many years ago saying the era of big government is over. And I think a lot of Democrats being very critical of that, saying, government has a role and has a responsibility. Yeah. When Obama talks about the limits of government, is he reaching out to that center that Kai was talking about?
Yeah, the hand of Ronald Reagan still sits over our American politics as much as anyone in the last 50 years, because Reagan was really the big anti-government guy. Yeah, it is. I mean, that's what he's doing. I think that's somewhat tempered by what happened in 2010. He had a big loss. I mean, this is a president who came in with a lot of enthusiasm and had a big loss in 2010. And this is going to be a very close race. And so he is reaching out beyond. It was a traditional Democratic constituencies, but it's also an ability to say, I'm not making government too big. I'm not the left-wing socialist everybody says I am. I mean, he's trying to walk a pretty narrow line. I want to make one other point. This whole convention, the Democrats, I thought was more successful than the Republicans, not for partisan reasons, but I think Republicans have a policy problem. And you saw the Democrats answer that. If you watch the Republican convention, if you're a small businessman or woman, you probably find that really attractive, right? I mean, everything was about success and the American dream. But not success for every single person, whether it's an immigrant or whether it's a young person, is not all about owning your own business or becoming rich. For a lot of people, it's having a good job, being able to raise your kids, maybe take a vacation once a year, have a decent, be able to come home and not be concerned that maybe your kid can go to college someday. And most of what the Republicans were was just like, get government out of the way, and everything is about sort of success and fulfilling the American dream. That's not necessarily a bad message. It's been successful for them, but it wasn't enough if you were the single mom at 25, or if you're the college student getting out with a lot of student loans, if you're the 55-year-old guy who lost his job as an engineer after 25 years, what am I going to do? And I don't think none of the Republicans really answer that, to me at least, in any satisfactory way. They're just like, if government gets out of the way, things will be better, jobs will be here, you'll be fine. And I think that that's just lacking for a lot of people, and I think what you saw here, a good speech tonight. I thought Bill Clinton did it, frankly, better last night, but make the case for, this is why I did what I did, this is why Democrats are doing what they're doing, this is what has happened to us as an economy, as a country, and this is where we're going. And I just thought that was lacking on the Republican side, and I thought it was laid out a little bit better in this convention.
Interesting to Matt's point, and Geneva, I'll come to you in just a second. I just want to read a quote that I saw on the Political website coverage of the speech. It said, rather than asking to be rewarded for a job well done, Obama's asking voters to trust him that his agenda will create a better future than that of Republicans. And that's essentially what you're saying here. Yeah, there have been some tough times, but look forward, and here's what I've got that they're not selling. Geneva, what were you going to say?
Well, I wanted to go back to your point, Dan, about the perhaps surprising emphasis on national security. It seems to me that was a very logical thing for Obama to do, just as so many in the Republican convention were appealing to women. That's, national security, we're strong. I hate to be stereotypical, but I remember a couple of us sort of laughing when he was saying this thing about, we've contained the Taliban and Osama bin Laden is dead, and the people were standing up going, we're white men, Those are the people Obama needs. I mean, that's whom he isn't doing very well with. So I think in some ways he might have been doing what we heard Ann Romney practically, rhapsodic about women, which they need to be, and maybe he was being, here we are with our strong military appealing to a sector he isn't particularly strong with.
Well, you're right, and public opinion polls show that in order for Obama to be reelected, he needs to win between 38 and 40% of the white vote, and at this moment he's sitting right exactly there. Maybe that's an effort to shore it up, particularly white men. I'm gonna take the point that you guys were making and broaden it just a bit. And then after that, after each of you gets a chance to weigh in, I wanted to open it up to all of your guys' questions. Heading into the two conventions, if you look at public opinion polling, it seemed that both candidates had one overriding strength and one overriding challenge. Barack Obama's greatest strength, according to these polls, is even given the difficulties that the country's faced over the last 3.5 years, the American people, by and large, still liked him and still respected him. But in increasing numbers, swing voters at least, were beginning to doubt whether he knew what it took to fix this economy. Mitt Romney, on the other hand, according to these same swing voters, did seem to have a greater level of knowledge about the economy, but they didn't trust him. They didn't trust him more specifically to look out for their interests over his own, to look out for the interests of the middle class over the wealthy. So the Republican convention last week, it seems to me, was designed, particularly Romney's speech was designed to say, hey, look, you can trust me. I'm not that evil guy that you've been hearing about all summer. And whether he accomplished that or not is a conversation we can have a little bit later. But it seems to me going into this week, Barack Obama's goal wasn't about trust, wasn't about likability, wasn't about emotional connection. Those things all existed. But rather to say to the American people, I know what to do going forward. And so I think the question I'd put to the panel is, over the course of the week, and more specifically tonight, do the American people have a better idea what the president will do next to fix this economy if given another 4 years?
And that's where the word patience did come in. He kept talking about that as a long road. I think his effort, at least, and I don't know whether he was successful, you're exactly right about what he needed to do, and it seems to me that his effort was to say, we are doing the right things, we are taking the right steps, it will take a while, and it was patience.
Interesting. So he wasn't saying, okay, I've got something new I'm going to try now.
No.
He's going to say, we're going to keep doing this, and it just needs a little bit more time to work.
A lot more time.
Kaya, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, no, I don't. To be honest, no, I don't think he added a lot new. I think this was very much like his States of the Union speeches. I don't say that critically. I don't think there's a lot new. I think Romney has had a lot of opportunities to get in there and say, this is my alternate vision for the country. And I just think, for whatever reason, he seems to me to be constitutionally incapable of doing that in a compelling way. I think most people have kind of baked in where they think this president is. He's mildly unpopular. Not terribly unpopular. This isn't George W. Bush, but people would like things to be better. I think there's room for someone to make the case on the Republican side. I don't think they've been able to make it. I don't think the speech changes this all that much, frankly. But I do think at the end of the day, people do trust him more. He is more compelling. He's more likable. And who's the guy you want to wake up with for the next 4 years? And I think until Romney makes a better case that he's going to make people's lives better, and I think he tried to do a little bit of that in Tampa, but I still think you're going to see the president ahead. I think he's probably going to gain a couple of points off of this. And unless something big happens in the debates, I think it's going to be a struggle for Romney to pull ahead of this guy.
Let me follow up on you real quick, Matt, and then I'll come to you, Kaya. You used an interesting set of adverbs there. Trust him more. Follow him more. Feel like he has a better path. Yeah. The same thing struck me in listening to the president's speech tonight. This speech was a lot more about contrast than most acceptance speeches are. What I hear you saying, and tell me if I'm overreading into your point, is, all right, I can't lay out that plan for you in detail yet, but I can tell you, based on what I've done so far, my answer is better than his.
Yeah, this is a classic. This is so much like 2004 for me, at least. It's unbelievable. I worked for Gephardt in the primaries and then Kerry, and it's just a lot like that. Kerry got the nomination. People were, united behind him, but there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm. For as much as everyone criticizes George W. Bush, he was actually a very good candidate, an excellent candidate in 2000, excellent in 2004, and he was a compelling guy. And he had a couple of issues going his way. He had likability. People sort of trusted him more. He had the national security piece. 9/11 wasn't that far removed as much as it is now. And people just looked at Kerry and they're like, no. And I just think there's an element with Romney that's like, nope. And in Bush's case, he completely decided to run a contrast campaign and basically a negative campaign. And that's what this campaign's been, which is these are all the horrible things Romney will do if he gets elected. And Romney just can't get above that. He just can't seem to get above the clouds here and make that case to people, I think.
I'm not sure if Mitt Romney or John Kerry would be more offended by the comparison you just made between them.
They both have gray hair. Great hair. They have great hair.
So Kaya, I'm going to keep doing what we've been doing. It's going to take more time to get it done. But if we go the other way, really bad things are going to happen. Is that the core of the message, and is that enough?
I mean, I think Obama didn't feel like he had to give you a point-by-point plan. The 999 plan's not necessary. He's been here for 4 years, right? So that's the advantage of the incumbent, is he doesn't have to spell it out because it's in the news every single day. But Obama's somebody that likes a challenge. He's somebody that stands up, and when somebody asks him a question, he wants to answer it, and he wants to answer it the best that anybody could possibly answer it. And so what Romney asked him in his speech in the Republican National Convention was, how have you helped us for the last 4 years? What have you done for us for the last 4 years? And I think Obama was like, all right, here it is. And he listed a whole host of accomplishments. We've heard them all before, message repetition, right? But I think that one of the most striking accomplishments that he listed was the auto industry. And then he very kind of poetically took that into the future with his really loyal appeal to alternative energy. He's stuck to that. He doesn't care about Solyndra. He's going to keep going with that. And so I think that that's the way that he brought us into the future with kind of talking about that. But really, he wanted to answer the question. He wanted to say, what have we done for the past 4 years? And my question is, do people care? Do people care what he's done for the past 4 years? Yes, they do. But I don't know if they care about that as much as they care about what he's done for us lately. And so as much as he may have been nervous for this speech, I doubt after all these years that he is nervous for any speech, I think he's extremely nervous for tomorrow when the jobs report comes out. I think that's what people care about.
Wow, great point. And maybe it's something we can talk about as we broaden the discussion. That, of course, the great irony is in about 12 hours, we're going to see the new job figures for the month of September. We'll see only 2 more of those before the election.
Probably have more to do with the election results than anything either of these guys said.
Good. So we'll come back at 5:30 in the morning and have a discussion about the jobs numbers for anybody who'd like to join us. In the meantime, though, let's open up this discussion. And if you have any question, if you have a question you'd like to ask of our panel, please raise your hand. And what I'll ask is our custom, for those of you who attend these events, have attended these events in the past now, is we'll ask 2 things of you. Number one, if you have a question to ask, to just tell us who you are so we know who's asking the question. And number 2, if you're asking a question particularly of one of us who said something with whom that you disagree, we'd ask that you frame your question to them with the same level of respect that you'd hope they would show to you if they disagreed with something that you said. So with that, how about a question? Yes?
Hi, I'm EJ Levin, a freshman and IR major. And I was just wondering, hello? Okay. I was just wondering, I had read, I think yesterday, that after the Democratic National Convention, Republicans said they would step up on an ad blitz using super PAC money in swing states. How do you think that will affect the election, or do you think that at this point it's almost kind of set in stone?
Matt, why don't we start with you on that? Obviously, in 2008, the Obama campaign had a considerable financial advantage over the resources that McCain had. This year, the shoe's very much on the other foot. How much of a problem does that create? A significant problem for Obama? Or at a certain point, do you get to a level of saturation advertising or it just doesn't matter as much anymore?
Yeah, it's unclear. I really don't know. People are about to get carpet bombed. If they think they've seen a lot so far, this is going to be like Dresden in World War II. Really, I think, I don't know. I tend to think those kind of ads are a little bit more effective in like local races, you know, when you have a large disparity. Because at the end of the day, people, it's not like someone's waking up being like, Barack Obama, who's that guy? You know, this is not the case. So he's a pretty known entity. So, and I think consumers, especially over the last, you know, when I was a kid, you had some ads that were really powerful, and I just find it's hard to. There was like a few ads when I was a kid that were like stuck out. There's like a Willie Horton ad. There were ads in like 1984's race with Reagan versus Mondale that people remembered. There's a famous ad called the Daisy ad that Lyndon Johnson ran against Barry Goldwater that basically was going to blow the world up. It was only shown one time. Now the ads, it's just more volume that they just put on anywhere they can get. I don't know if it's going to make that big of a difference. I think those things are more important in sort of local races. That said, you know, if it gets close, you know, it's important. But I tend to think that the president will have a financial disadvantage, but it's not going to be so much that he's just, I mean, McCain, we were just blowing McCain out of the water. He had nothing. But that's really not the case now. It's just going to annoy the heck out of people in about 10 states.
And just to build on Matt's point real quick, and then we'll go on to more questions, I think the point's an important one. A campaign for Congress or for state legislature or for city council, that advertising makes a lot of difference because most voters aren't going to know a lot about the campaign. You got to work really, really hard not to know much about Barack Obama or Mitt Romney by this point or by Election Day. And because the news media does such thorough coverage of the campaign, the information disparity isn't as significant as it might be in a lower ticket race. The other point I'd make really quick is at a certain point you just can't run any more ads. I mean, you physically can, but they just don't have a difference. They just don't make a difference anymore. So rather than the poor innocents in a particular media market seeing hundreds of thousands of ads instead of tens of thousands of ads, the real difference in terms of money is not that they're running more advertisements in a particular location, but that they're running ads in a broader range of places. Normally in a presidential campaign, the last couple weeks before the election day, you're sitting in the headquarters saying, wow, should we spend that money on ads in Ohio or should we spend that money on ads in Florida? Should we spend that money on ads in Virginia or should we spend that money on ads in Colorado? If you got a super PAC in your pocket, you can run ads in all those places and don't have to make the difficult decisions. Yes?
Actually, my question's sort of a follow-up to that idea.
Okay, and you are?
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Gabby. I'm a specialized journalism student. So not only running ads, across the country, but really now there's the whole digital landscape to open up for a campaign strategy. And so my question is, there's been a lot of talk about how Twitter's really played into these conventions, and obviously the Democratic Convention has had a huge response online. And how will that really impact this election, especially if some of the key demographics aren't really digital savvy?
Okay. Well, Kaya, maybe you can start by talking about a demographic that is more digitally savvy, and talk about how online communication and social networking is an integral part of your work.
I mean, I wouldn't be able to get 65 people to our first meeting last week if it weren't for Facebook. We still put up flyers. We're not, letting go of the old school style, and the Obama campaign certainly isn't letting go of that either. They always say to their field representatives, you make a phone call, you make a real phone call, you make a real handshake. It's worth way more than a bunch of likes on Facebook. But I think what is important about it's important to remember with the digital age is that, a tweet is one thing, but it's really when you can be innovative in turning that online presence, that online buzz is what they call it, into action when it's successful. And I think iPhone apps are actually the new thing Romney put out this iPhone app to announce the Veep, and it was all the rage for a while. And go.
Oh, sorry. I just want to get the professor's take. I don't want to depress all the students here. I think Twitter's been horrible for politics. And I think a lot of, I'll explain, I want to I think a lot of social networks have been awful for journalism over the last 20 years. And I'll tell you why. Twitter has made this so that we are chasing every ridiculous story and every kind of lame brain scoop and gaffe of the day, and half of them don't even turn out to be true. So what the problem is, you've lost a lot of long-form journalism where people actually are able to study what a subject is and push it out there. Because if you are a Democrat, then you read blue stuff, you read Huffington Post, and you feel good because you read people who agree with you all day long. And if you're a Republican, you read Red State or whatever that is, and you agree with people all day long. And so you're just self-righteous. You just sort of luxuriate in your self-righteousness. But it's very difficult to find a lot of good journalism. And it's not that it isn't out there, but not as many people are reading the New Yorker or some other pieces. But a lot of journalists, they are frustrated because they are just chasing the tweet and whatever the campaigns are trying to push. And most of it is some faux outrage about what some surrogate said about God knows what. And when I was doing it in 2008, I didn't have, but watching this play out, to me it's been a horrible campaign on that front because every single day it's some ridiculous silliness. And I just think journalism's lost a lot because of that, because the journalists feel obligated to go chase everything, because if not, that's the way the campaigns are pushing news out there. So I don't know if you had a take on it.
I would say, Geneva, does the director of the Annenberg Journalism School have any thoughts on this?
I do, yes, thank you. I think that's a lot of sins to hang on Twitter. I mean, Twitter has had some influence.
I don't just mean Twitter, but I mean the essence of where we are.
Yeah, but to continue my point, there have always been lots of distractions during campaigns. Certainly with social media, there are a lot more. But there is still a great deal of good journalism being done. So what you're describing is much more about a personal choice. I mean, this stuff is so addictive that a lot of people would rather spend their time on Twitter. But remember that links on Twitter take people to the speeches that they missed. And there's a lot of substantial stuff that comes people's way by their being part of social networks. And I think, people refer one another to both ridiculous things and substantial things. So I actually feel much more excited and hopeful about the role of social media. I think it's the same as with everything about journalism. We're no longer in control of it all. It's no longer all top down. And we can do all the great things we think should be done and tell you what you need to know. But the fact is that you now are co-creators, and we got to figure out how, as a nation, we're going to continue to have reliable, substantial information, but in ways that embrace these new tools, which actually can make that supply of information more democratic and richer. So I think we're very much in transit towards something. Right now it's kind of messy, but there's some real upsides to it.
And I think Geneva makes a particularly important point here about the shift of responsibility in the news conversation. As when I started in politics a trillion years ago, there was a very small number of people who made those decisions. The editors of the Washington Post and the New York Times and the anchor men of the three major broadcast networks decided what was newsworthy and what wasn't. And of course, what has happened, first with the advent of cable television, then with online communication, and now with social networking, is that responsibility shifts from those five old white men to each individual voter on his or her own to decide how to separate the wheat from the chaff. I think Matt makes a great point. There's a lot of chaff out there to separate, but Geneva's right also. There's a lot of wheat for those people who are willing to put in the time and effort. Before we go on, I want to underscore a point that Kaya made, because it's a critically important one about online communication. And Gabby, your question was a very good one. After the 2008 election, we had a post-election conference in which we brought in some of the senior people from the Obama and the McCain campaigns, and we'll do the same thing this year in November. And one of our guests was Joe Rossbars, who ran online media for the Obama campaign, and he made Kaya's point even more emphatically. He said online political activity is absolutely worthless unless it results in offline political activity. And he goes, you can exchange as many emails as you want. That was in an era before texting was quite as predominant as it is today. You can exchange as many emails as you want, but if none of those emails get a real live volunteer off of his real live couch down the real live street to knock on somebody else's real live door, then it didn't make a difference. Other questions? Yes?
Hi, I'm Georgian. I'm a music student. I wanted to ask all of you about thoughts on the few jabs that he made at his opponents and at the Republican Party in general. He said, he had the code joke, if you get a code, just cut taxes and call me in the morning. He said, my opponents are new to foreign policy. And he said that things have changed, I'm not a candidate, I'm the president. Which seems such jabs and a few more intend to diminish Romney's stature and to make him seem silly and small, and it hasn't really been talked about, so I was wondering what you guys thought.
Geneva, we mentioned this briefly earlier, but this speech was a lot heavier on contrast than acceptance speeches normally are. Talk a little bit about what you think the motivation there was for Obama and his campaign to spend as much time as Gary said, really drawing such a stark contrast and taking some pretty sharp shots at the opposition.
Yeah, I mean, that, take two tax cuts, roll back some regulations, and call us in the morning. I actually thought it was pretty funny, but it was more about contrast. And I was starting to think, as I listened to it, was that in reaction to last week? Well, last week was a lot about contrast. But this one was more about contrast as an incumbent than would be typical. Yeah. I think you're right. I don't know that the jabs were any nastier than usual, really. I wasn't struck by that. I thought the foreign policy one was a little, kind of a sneer without much. It wasn't offering a lot. But it didn't strike me, actually, I'm sorry I'm just babbling around, it didn't strike me that it was filled with savage cuts, really.
But as you said, a little bit more directed, maybe not in terms of severity, but in terms of direction.
Yeah, when he talked about, I'm not going to cut child care in order to fund millionaires. I'm not going to, that litany that he went through, which was quite rousing, all the good guy things that we're not willing to cut in order to make some fat cat even richer. That was the kind of contrast that I think he was drawing that was really outstanding. It wasn't really a cut example. I mean, it wasn't really too much of a jab. I don't know.
And I would say that I think the contrast was the place that he finally got to be. After speaking last, after all of these different people who spoke before him, and I think Clinton did a lot of work for him. I think that Michelle did some work for him. I think that people have made the jabs that they needed to, and so what you saw was not a personal attack, but a policy attack. He knows that this is just an election between two very different philosophies on how to run government, how to run the economy. I think that he didn't have to say, Republicans are stupid for doing this. He just says, this is how we're set apart, and I think that he wanted to set himself apart because, it's hard to sometimes.
Matt, thoughts on this?
No, just, that's where his policies haven't worked. I don't mean that negative. I mean that voters are going to say, okay, what are you going to do in the next 4 years that you didn't have a chance to do in the first 4? So he has to turn around and say, make a contrast. I mean, that's what he has to do. I mean, I don't think he had much of a choice. I mean, this isn't Bill Clinton in 1996 when things are good. When things are good, you get up there and say, look at all the things I've done. People are pretty happy. We're going to do more of that. Things will keep going. He knows that he has to sit there and say, look, things got to get better in the next 4 years. So he has a higher burden and threshold to say, okay, well, what are you going to do to make my life better? Because people's lives, I don't think, are as good or as better as they hoped that they would be. And so he has more of a burden that he's got carrying into the convention.
Gary, I'll go back to the quote I read from the Politico analysis earlier because I think it helps address your question. Again, what Politico said is rather than asking to be rewarded for a job well done, Obama was asking voters to trust him that his agenda will create a better future than the Republicans. And the key word there is better future than the Republican, and that leads to the kind of contrast you were asking about. My own opinion, and we can talk more about it if other people have thoughts on it, is I think the shots he took on foreign policy, on Russia, on Romney's trip to the Olympics, those played pretty well. The shots he took on social policy, he said if a healthcare policy is hoping you don't get sick, if your kids grow up near a contaminated river, well, that's too bad. I think that sort of thing works for his benefit. The one that I think may end up turning in the other direction is the takes two tax cuts and cut regulations and call me in the morning. I'm guessing there are some Republican operatives either in Tampa or back in Boston right now thinking about how to turn that into a message saying Obama wants to raise your taxes. So on the economic front, that one will get the most play. That might have been the riskiest of the shots just because it's the one that at least potentially lends itself most to a Republican counterpush. Yes?
Before I came here, I covered a lot of oil and natural gas companies as part of my former job, and so I was kind of interested in your take on his discussion of his energy policy, all the above energy policy, which we talked about last spring, because my impression of him had always been that he's a very pragmatic president when it comes to energy policy, which angers Republicans and infuriates conservation efforts as well. Because what I heard him say tonight was, yes, he did want to continue endorsing alternative energy, but he also gave a very strong endorsement to natural gas, which can't be separated from hydraulic fracturing. And so I was kind of interested in your take on his energy policy tonight. Did that do enough to excite the people who the green side of his base?
Matt, speaking of things that you don't normally hear at a Democratic convention, we can add to the list applause for a candidate who talks about increased oil exploration. That was rare.
That's a classic case of speaking beyond the room. You know that had Mitt Romney delivered that same line, all the Democrats in the room obviously would have been horrified. You're naturally more inclined to, give him a pass on that. But that's speaking past the room. I think he knows that it's popular in some areas of the country. It's popular in some areas of the country that he needs to win, the Pennsylvanias, the other parts of the country. So I think that was a classic case of kind of reach beyond and say, look, I have a reasonable policy. We can't give up on clean energy technologies because at the end of the day, they're the wave of the future, and I'm not going to just, go back to where we were 50 years ago because that's irresponsible. But at the same time, I've opened up areas to drilling. I've opened up new, oil and gas exploration. But I think that's a classic case of speaking beyond the room, knowing that he was going to have the room in other areas. This is kind of a classic base election. I mean, the enviros aren't going anywhere else. So I think he felt like that was one of those kind of issues where he can reach out and talk to people in different states, and that's what he was doing.
It's a complicated menu, though, right? I mean, he's always pursued a complicated menu on energy. He does piss off the environmentalists, and you're right, they're not going anywhere else, but he also needs to get people pumped, and this isn't going to pump environmentalists. On the other hand, when he talks about alternative energy, a lot of people think, Solyndra, and that doesn't work so well for him either. I think the thing there that he stressed, and he said it twice, I think, in two different ways, everybody can gather around diminishing our reliance on foreign oil. And he talked about that a couple of times.
And Kaya, this was another one of the contrasts that we've been talking about. He said, I have supported expanded drilling, but I'm not going to turn our coastline over to the oil companies. Okay. I've got a reasonable position, not like those freaks on the other side.
Right. I mean, I think you could say that he's trying to have his cake and eat it too, but I think what he's doing is he's showing that he has a short-term view and a long-term view of what to do. And I think he's also responding to another one of Romney's challenges. One of Romney's statements in his speech was, when you look at your gas pump go up to $50 and you keep going, and I think what he's trying to say is, no, I will not let that happen, but I'm also not going to let us pummel into an economic and environmental disaster that is climate change.
So Kaya, just as a follow-up, you would argue that the Democratic base is willing to hear talk about expanded oil drilling as long as there is also emphasis on the development of alternative energies and green technologies and so on.
I think it depends on the Democrat.
Depends on
And
the
also
Democrat.
a protest against, further lining the pockets of big oil, which he threw in there too.
And it is worth, and this is not new. It's worth noting that the week before the BP oil spill, the president had begun to talk about expanded drilling off of Florida and Virginia, again in a fairly measured way, but no question an expansion, and that went away after the spill. But it is not something he is introducing new to the campaign, and creates some of the base motivation challenges that Kaya was talking about earlier. You've been very patient.
I was in the stadium for the 2008 speech that he delivered in Denver and the night before for Joe Biden. And there was a really strong feeling of revolution in the air those nights that I felt was really lacking tonight. It felt very political, a lot of reflection on the last 4 years, whereas his initial speech in 2008 looked forward more and laid out a lot of plans for what he was going to be doing in the future. So I was a little bit disappointed in the fact that he failed to mention what he will do with the next 4 years. He talked about delivering 100,000 new math and science teachers, which is an admirable goal towards increasing education. But overall, I think he failed to speak beyond the room to a really important voter base, and that voter base is people like me. Single, straight, white males. And his plan seems to be, I'm going to take your money through taxes and pay for health care with it. He developed the narrative of the child in Arizona who will receive treatment, which was very promising because it was taken from policy towards a more narrative to benefit people.
I think you raise a really important point here. And Geneva, let me start with you on this. It's a lot harder to be magic when you're already in charge. In other words, a challenger, an outsider, a new face can by definition be more aspirational than one who has a 4-year record, whether it's one that voters think highly of or not. And that's the real challenge for the campaign. How do you remotivate groups of voters? And this is where the conversation started. How do you remotivate groups of voters that were so excited 4 years ago, who have since then been confronted with 3.5 years of the realities of governance?
I think he went there and acknowledged that when he said, I really think he got so much applause that he didn't get to sort of slide into what he meant to say right after he said, I am a different person. I was a candidate. Now I am the president. I think the real thing, then remember the next words he said, as I recall them, were, I've held in my arms the mothers and fathers of people who didn't return from. And I think he did mean to say, I am a different person. I don't think he came off as exactly, it wasn't just the same speech. It was a different speech. He didn't give us glorious, new, but in a way, I don't think he could have. I mean, who would buy that we could do glorious new things in this economic straits we're in? I think that would have just been, derided as hopeless dreams, and we can't follow him because he makes promises we can't pursue. I mean, maybe you don't mean financial ones, but I really think he was in a very tough place to do any new promising. I think he probably made the right choice to say, It's going to be long, steady march, and it is sort of asking for patience, which is hard to get people riled up about. What would have made you excited?
I would have liked to hear how he developed a conversation around creating a stronger economy and more innovation, and he did touch on delivering more jobs at home because made in America, we make quality products, and I found a lot of resonance in that. But the whole night felt a lot more smaller and isolated because he was speaking to roughly 11,000 people tonight. And then prior, he was addressing 80,000 in the football stadium, and there was fireworks.
But the weather interfered, you know. They had moved all the equipment over and built the stage and everything.
Did you watch Clinton's speech last night?
No, I was in class.
Watch it and let me know what you think about how he defines what this election was about versus what you saw tonight. I'd be curious.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm a public diplomacy student, so I'm going to ask about global public opinion of Obama. I don't see this, in this current campaign, either him or Secretary Clinton or Vice President Biden really talking about the successes that Obama has had beyond killing Osama bin Laden, but as far as increasing the image of the United States abroad, the reset with Russia, things like that. Is that a problem for Obama? Is he sort of stuck in the narrative of the Romney campaign where it's all about who cares what the globe thinks, it's all about flexing our muscles?
Well, that's interesting. He did speak about building alliances, a minor point that he made, but he did speak about that with some pride. He went through a litany of some things about what he'd done abroad, and they weren't all muscles. He spoke about building alliances.
And Kaya, it seems to me one of the challenges is getting voters to focus on those critically important issues when they are focused on an even more critically important set of issues in terms of economic growth and job creation. Romney, of course, was derided last week for not mentioning Afghanistan in his speech. And you're right, although Obama did spend some more time on these issues, he certainly didn't get into the types of specifics that you're talking about. People want to hear about jobs, huh?
Yeah, no, people want to, he's limited. People want to hear about what's in front of them. What's in front of them is tomorrow. What's in front of them is the jobs report. And I think that actually goes back to what you were saying. We're all hankering after this revolutionary explosion like there was in 2008. I mean, I'm the president of Students for Barack Obama, and where's my crowd? You know, where's my rally? Where's Obama himself? And I think we have to be patient, and we have to wait because our issues will come up. I mean, you're passionate about foreign policy. I am as well. But I think that we're not going to get what we want to see happen politically until the kind of economic debate has really hashed itself out. And we'll see. Maybe there will be a turning point soon with that, and something else will be the focus.
And Kaya may be right. My own guess is barring some type of very, very difficult flare-up in Iran, or more likely an even worsening situation in Syria, it's difficult to see the conversation turning toward foreign policy beyond bin Laden and Gaddafi soundbite discussion. That said, as I think many of you know, one of the three presidential debates is set aside specifically for a 90-minute discussion about foreign policy. I will hazard you a guess that both candidates and their advisors are already figuring about how to pivot from a foreign policy discussion into a conversation about trade, into a conversation about job creation and economic growth. So even in a foreign policy debate, I'm not sure that you're going to see the answers you're looking for to your question, at least not from the candidates themselves. Yes, in the back.
So, I mean, during like a candidate's second term, we usually see them push for something that they might not have pushed for in their first term because of its political unpopularity. So my question is, do you think that if Obama gets elected, there will be a policy agenda that he will push for that maybe we haven't seen him talk about so much in speeches like tonight?
Don't know. Well, a couple things. I would say I think there's a chance he might try to do some clean energy stuff, which I don't think he was able to do in the first term. And he's a guy who likes to check things off his list. So I would look for something in terms of either some kind of cap and trade. But I think a lot's going to be determined in the lame duck session. Whoever gets elected, there's going to be a lame duck session. They've got to figure out tax policy for next year. So I don't think it's really clear what he's going to be able to pursue. for two reasons. One is we have to see what the Congress is going to look like, and no matter what happens with this election, whether Romney wins or Obama wins, barring something shocking, neither side's going to have much leeway in terms of Congress. Republicans are probably going to keep the House. The Senate's going to be close, but who cares with the filibuster? It's going to be tight. So I don't think it will matter all that much who the Senate leader is. So I think they've got to get through the lame duck, get through the debt ceiling, and then I think you'll see either what damage or what possibility for something big might be there. But realistically, the Congress is going to be very, very close and not that much different than what it's been the last couple of years. So I could see him trying to do something on cap and trade, some kind of energy legislation, but I don't think that will be clear until we get past the lame duck and through the debt ceiling fight.
I don't know if you saw the Peter Baker story in the New York Times this morning, but it alleges that Obama harbors some hope, we don't know how fragile it might be, that once he's reelected, if he's reelected, that the kind of driving force for many Republicans, not all, but many in Congress that has been, don't let Obama accomplish anything, will be at least diluted because there's no worry that he would be reelected again, and that there might be some hope of achieving some of the fiscal agreements, for example, that couldn't have been achieved before.
I'll offer you a few thoughts. One, I think, while I don't agree with Matt on cap and trade, I think it's as long as the Republican Party is situated where it is, and as long as there are enough Rust Belt Democrats in Congress, I don't know that cap and trade goes anywhere, but I do think you see some movement on other types of clean energy, wind, solar expansion, so on. Second is immigration reform. Both George W. Bush and Karl Rove have both said that if they could have done that second term over, instead of beginning with Social Security reform after Bush was reelected and then trying to go on to immigration after that, they both felt that they, in retrospect, should have begun his second term with immigration reform when he would have had the political capital to help push through a Kennedy McCain naturalization and legalization bill. And while Obama hasn't put the political capital behind that effort in his first 4 years in office, a newly reelected president could very well make efforts in that direction. And then finally is budget reform. As Matt and Geneva both said, if Obama is reelected, and if Romney's elected, he faces the same challenge of an immediate budgetary and fiscal meltdown as the tax apocalypse approaches. And it's worth remembering that Barack Obama and John Boehner were that close to a grand agreement on entitlement reform and deficit reduction. And ultimately it fell apart, as Bob Woodward is reporting this week, more because of a series of misunderstandings between the two sides than deep-seated differences. And if a Democratic president and a Republican speaker can get that close heading into midterm elections, their chances of making progress on that front, and I don't mean to sound like an ingenue, I think might get much better in a second term if both men are thinking about their places in history. And I think both Barack Obama and John Boehner would be more than happy to grant the other one a place in history if it meant one for themselves too. Yes?
I'm Graham. I'm a philosophy, politics, and law major. And I have a question, but first I'd like to comment on the idea that it wasn't as moving in a revolutionary sense. I think that it's, because I felt it too, 2008 was just very a moving time. Revolutionary figure, first potential black president. But I think that it's virtually impossible to make the claim of revolution when you have been the president for the last 4 years and are, versus being almost, the junior senator that could, So I think that needs to be taken into account. And the distinction that you pointed out that, saying I am, I was the candidate and now I'm the president is an important distinction to make for that reason. But my question is that a lot of the pundits have been saying that this election has been, or this campaign has been, and this election will be more about energizing the bases rather than pulling potential swing voters. I want to know if you think that's true, and also if the conventions, both Republican and Democratic, have been successful in doing so.
Great point. According to the NBC Pew poll, a whopping 3% of the electorate is undecided in this campaign. And simple math suggests that spending a lot of time and money fighting over 3% rather than trying to motivate 47 or 48% isn't a tough call to make. Is this a base motivation election? And if so, who does that help?
I mean, yes, it is a base motivation election. I think it helps both campaigns for different reasons. It helps Obama because he has an extremely loyal base. It's what he's good at. It's what he knows how to. We like campaign Obama. We don't really like President Obama. And I think he's trying to say, no, like President Obama too. But it helps Romney as well because he's really, since after the long, drawn out nomination process happened, the Republican Party has consolidated, and he's really caught on with this family values rhetoric, with this whole idea of church community that I mentioned earlier. He's doing well with it, and he had a lot more energy than I've ever seen him have in his speech last week. So I think that they're both going to play it to their best advantage, but ultimately Obama's got the loyal base motivation approach.
Matt, Geneva?
I think there's a real challenge for a person who is defined as change, which Obama really is. And now he can't be about change because he's been leading us for 4 years. So what's he changing against? Meanwhile, what Romney has going for him is that his base really is energized by a kind of a resistance to the change we have been seeing, the change in the complexion of America to some extent, the change in the mores of America in the minds of many in that all last week, I think. Change that looks fearful to people. That's more, in some ways, more motivating. A resistance to change can motivate them, whereas excitement about change is hard for Obama because he's the guy. We know what we get, and he can't really stand up there and say, "Look at all the razzle dazzle that's coming." Yeah, the economy still really stinks, but and we all know the politics is just practically frozen in strife. I mean, it's a tough.
So hang in there with me is not nearly as compelling a bumper sticker as change you can believe in. Matt?
I just tend to think, don't listen to the pundits. That's your first advice right there. No, I think that's just a bit of a simplistic way to look at it, to be totally honest. There are fewer and fewer people who are registering as Democrat and Republicans. There's a lot more independents, right? And so you have, these things tend to swing back and forth. I mean, there are, as Dan mentioned, there are fewer undecided voters this time. But at the end of the day, you're still always, you have these independents who aren't kind of really independents or sort of lean one way or the other. So you have both sides spending a lot of time talking to their base, but that always happens leading up to the final couple of months. Romney needed to do it longer because he had trouble solidifying them because they've always been suspicious of him. The presidents need to do a little bit longer for two reasons. One is the changing demographics of the country give him a few more paths to victory. And the second one is, again, he's got some challenges because the economy is still weak and a lot of the shine, as people have even here have talked about, has come off him a little bit. So he needs to spend a little bit more time I think, working his base. But at the end of the day, these swing states are very close. So you're still going to need to be talking to independent voters. They are going to be the ones, the true independents and the true swings are still going to decide the election. So if you win those extra 2 or 3% in Florida, Mitt Romney does, he's going to win. If he doesn't, he's not going to win. I just think it's overly simplistic to me. It's just a base election, or it's just the undecided voters and the independents are still going to decide this at the end of the day, even if they're a smaller slice than they might have been in previous polling.
And I don't think Matt meant that to sound as critical to your question as it probably came across, because even though ultimately the political center does decide these elections, there is less of a center in this election than we have seen in years past, and so I think your question is well placed for that reason. Geneva.
Quick point. The thing we haven't mentioned, the most wild card candidate is one we haven't mentioned. I think Ryan both has a real opportunity to energize the Republican base, but he also could really make things dicey because he's the candidate people don't really know. And he's definitely a candidate who has had very different positions from ones that Romney has held, and we really haven't seen all that play out.
Yeah, the Ryan selection was fascinating in one particular way, in that if you remember the weekend that his selection was announced, both parties were thrilled. Yeah. Both parties were very excited. Both parties became very motivated by the choice, which seems to me is a tacit admission by the Romney campaign as to the import of the question that was just asked. Because if you think about it, if you take half a step back, neither Obama nor Romney has a particularly motivated base at this point. Matt was talking a moment ago about some of the challenges Romney has had with his base. You know, his religious faith causes problems with some religious conservatives. His history on a range of social and cultural issues causes problems with others. These are not people who are going to cross over and vote for Barack Obama, but need to be motivated to turn out in November. And as several of you have talked about over the course of this conversation, the president's base is not nearly as motivated as it was in 2008 for the most understandable of reasons, as our panelists have talked. So on one hand, you've got a very polarized electorate for all sorts of reasons, and we'll talk about this at a variety of forums we do over the course of this semester, why the electorate is so polarized and hyperpartisan. I hope you'll come back for those discussions. But you start out with a very partisan electorate. Then you add two candidates who aren't particularly motivating to their respective bases. And the end result is a campaign where the two candidates do spend a lot more time talking to their bases than we normally see, even if, as Matt correctly suggests, they ultimately move back to the center in November.
Just to get back to what you were saying. This is why I think the Paul Ryan choice personally was horrible, and not because I'm a Democrat. No, really, because if you don't have, the fact is, Obama's like wildly unpopular with the Republican base. So if you don't have them motivated by now, I don't know what's going to motivate them. The problem with Ryan, to me, was that he just opened up a whole series of policies that they can go after. So sort of along the lines of the questions you were asking, like where do you go after swing voters, or how much of them? I don't think there are a lot of them, but there's enough that I think Ryan has opened a whole treasure trove of going after for whether it's for Medicare, whether it's sort of his faux kind of budget plan, whether it's all the cuts that he's going to put out there. So that's why I wasn't dismissive of your question. I don't think there is as large a pool of swing voters out there, but it's enough that I think some of the stuff that Ryan's had in his history and his sort of lack of conviction also on sticking to those budget plans that he's put out there, I think is really going to hurt them. That's why I just never quite understood what the Ryan choice was all about.
We could easily do an hour on the Paul Ryan selection alone and another 4 hours talking about his marathon time.
Yeah, was it 4
but,
hours?
Yeah, or whatever it was.
More than 4 hours.
All kidding aside, we could certainly go on for most of the night because there's an awful lot to talk about in this campaign. That said, we know all of you have other obligations, academic and professional and otherwise. So rather than keeping this conversation going for the rest of the evening, what instead we'll ask you to do is join us in the future. As I mentioned earlier, every Wednesday we meet over in the Student Center at 11:30 for food, at 12 o'clock from 12 to 1 for a panel discussion on a different facet of the campaign. And we hope you'll join us next Wednesday for a discussion on issues relating to the economy and entitlements, 12 to 1 in the Taper Center. Also, if you look at the Unruh Institute website, you'll see both midday and evening programs that we're sponsoring. We hope you'll join us for those also. But right now, please join me in thanking Matt Rodriguez, Kaya Masler, and Geneva Overholzer for a terrific conversation.